When knitting my basic beanie, I noticed that I did something weird and created a hole right here where my finger's coming through. I'm going to show you how to fix this mistake, and this method can be applied to many different mistakes. We are going to remove the stitches from the knitting needles and backtrack to the mistake. First, we need to mark where the beginning of the row is, as we will remove the stitch marker when removing all the stitches. First, grab a piece of scrap yarn that's about 8 inches long. Then find the first stitch of the row, which is the stitch directly to the left of the marker. Each stitch creates a V shape. Bring your finger a few stitches or V's down. Then thread the scrap yarn through the right leg of a V a few rows down. This will help you keep track of the beginning of the row. You'll leave the scrap yarn hanging from the V, and don't worry, we'll remove it once we're finished fixing the mistake. Now remove all of your stitches from your needles. This may seem really scary, but don't worry, this is a process and we'll get your stitches back on. So keep pushing them over to one side and bringing them off the needle. And you'll bring the stitch marker off as well and make sure to just put it to the side because we'll need it again soon. Now, we are going to undo your stitches all the way to your mistake and finish at the beginning of the row, which we marked with your scrap yarn right here. Carefully pull your working yarn, undoing your stitches around the circle. We will pass the beginning of the row and continue around until we reach the mistake. If your mistake is a few rows down, you'll just keep undoing around the circle until you reach it. Now this stitch looks a little weird when I undo it because that's the mistake. So now that I passed the mistake, I'll continue on until I reach the beginning of the row, which is marked with the scrap yarn. So the last stitch that you'll undo is the beginning of the row stitch, and your scrap yarn should be just a few stitches below it. Now we will undo one more row, undoing one stitch at a time, and each time a stitch is undone, we will put it back on the knitting needle. To start, grab your knitting needles. We will just be using one of the needles. We will begin with the last stitch of the row, which is attached to the working yarn and is directly to the right of the stitch at the beginning of the row, which is marked with scrap yarn and was the last stitch that we undid. To begin, carefully pull the working yarn just out of this first stitch, leaving you with a loop. We will put this loop back on the knitting needle. Looking at this loop, also known as a stitch, it has a right side and a left side. When putting the stitch back on the needle, you will want the right side facing you. So I'm putting my knitting needle into the stitch, and the right side of the loop is facing me. Now, going counterclockwise around the project, I'll remove the working yarn just from the next stitch that's to the right. Again, I have a loop, and I'll insert the needle with the right side of the loop facing me. Continue to do this, going counterclockwise around your project until every stitch is back on your knitting needles. If a stitch accidentally comes undone for the row below, you will know because there will be a loop like this with a bar of yarn behind it. To fix this, simply bring the bar through the loop, coming from behind the loop through to the front of the loop, creating a new loop, and then place this loop on your knitting needle. This may not happen to you, so if it hasn't, just skip this part of the video and move on to the finish. Once you have all of your stitches back on your knitting needles, give yourself a pat on the back because you fixed your mistake. The first stitch of the row will be the top stitch on your left needle, and your scrap yarn will be attached a couple rows below. Feel free to remove that. Put your stitch marker on your right needle, signifying the beginning of the row, and you can begin knitting again.